A lot of that's geography. If you just look at geography, you can kind of see it's kind of a freeway. You look for Israel's kind of in a freeway between Africa and Europe and Asia. So it's always kind of been like a freeway. And I lived in Sicily, um, and for 3 years, and it's the same thing. It's always been attacked, because you look at it geography-wise, it's just kind of a freeway between Africa and Europe. Sicily is, so it's got kind of the same problem. It's just kind of it's kind of in the way. So people want to take it over. And one interesting side note on that is that's probably why there's kind of always been an under in Sicily. You talk about the mafia. Well, it's kind of there's always been an underground kind of government in Sicily because of this, because they've always been kind of overrun and controlled. Well, there's always been kind of an underground government there, and unfortunately, apparently, it kind of turned into the mafia. But and they're for real. Them people are for real. Make no mistake. It's frightening. You talk about. When I lived in Sicily, I mean, you talk about the, terrorists coming, and all this, but we had the terrorists there all the time. I mean, the mafia, much worse terrorist organization than, for us in Sicily than, all the rest, it seemed. I mean, they blew up. Like one of my friends, he lived on the side of the Mount Etna. We all lived on the side of Mount Etna, but they just blow up a police station. Just blow up, blew up a police station and other stuff. I mean, you go to a courthouse and it's surrounded by razor wire. I mean, these people are for real. So don't joke around about the mafia. I mean, they're for real. Okay, so that's that, and then so we'll get on backtrack here. But anyway, Israel's always been under attack from their start, from the north, from the south, and so finally they were overthrown and taken into exile. And I guess in the ancient world, when a country overtook another country, that's how they kind of forced themselves upon them. They would move people in to your country, and they would take people out from your country, and just to kind of weaken you. They didn't necessarily kill all of you. They just, they wanted to force their dominance on you. And so that's how they did it. And they took them into exile, into Babylon. And, and this was rough numbers, I guess, I always think 600 BC. 600 BC is when I guess actually maybe 605, when all this stuff started, the exile, and it lasted 70 years. The Bible predicts, it's going to be 70 years, and it's kind of interesting. It's not like you say 70 years. It's not like, okay, you start a clock, a clock, right? So it's 70 years from when the first. If you look at historically, it's 70 years from the time the first people were exiled till the first returned. And it's also 70 years from when the last exiles departed until they returned. So, but overall, it's much longer frame of mind, but it matches the 70 years on both of those counts. let's see. And I'm sure it was just a horrible time. You just think about, what would it be like to be exiled, out of your country. I guess the closest thing, I don't know if any of you are old enough for World War II at all. Yeah, I guess I see one hand here. Yeah, World War II is apparently horrific. Nowadays, they had an attack in Israel a couple of years ago, and 3,000 people were killed. And I think what is the number? I think, 3,000, and that's the total, 3,000. Well, during World War II, about 12 or 1,300 people World War II lasted 6 years. And for all of those 6 years, if you do the average, about 12 or 1,300 people were killed every hour for 6 long years. And you're like, nothing in my lifetime has been anywhere close to that.
Was that during the Holocaust?
Yeah, during the whole thing. That includes that's kind of, but if you just look at it, the Holocaust was during that. And I think that probably includes some of the interior purging, maybe in Russia during that time, where it's just incredible numbers when you compare it to today, because now when we see it in the thousands, we get, that's horrible, but that was 1,000 every hour, or less than an hour. Every 50 minutes, there was 1,000 people died on the average for World War II. Just a few years before, 14 years before I was born. Yeah, roughly, 14 years that all ended. But so this was a horrible time like that. We're just the most impossible, trying times. And Book of Ezekiel, he was kind of in the second wave, so he was taken into captivity in 597. So it started at 605, so 8 years later, he was taken into captivity at the same time as the king of Judah. And he was in exile until, really the rest of his life. But as far as the book of Ezekiel, his writing prophecies, they ended in 571. So about 22 years. So he started preaching and writing 5 years after he got into exile, and for 22 years he wrote and preached. And one thing that's interesting during all this, it wasn't like there's stuff still going on back in Israel, right? Back in Judah, the temple hadn't fallen when the first two waves had fallen. There's a lot of dates in here, and I don't want to, but anyway, you have a 605 BC, you have an exile at 597, you have another one. But then in 586, we should brand that all in our minds. Because 586 is when Jerusalem and the temple were actually destroyed back home. But there was already exiles. So they were still working on people. The Babylonians were still had this under siege. So that's like, that's like 20 years. If you look at it from a time standpoint, it's much longer than World War II. This is going on 20-some years, and actually, I guess 70 years or more. But this they're just battering Jerusalem, and you kind of wonder, how can they take that? I mean, you think about water supplies, right? I mean, Jerusalem had a nice water supply, but how can they take it for that long? And there's only so much food there. I mean, it looks to me like people are resilient. But how can you do without water? Well, they had a nice water supply, and somehow they got food, but how? How could you get food? I mean, I guess you can grow it on the rooftops and stuff, but I mean, hello?
I don't know a whole lot about the topic, and I couldn't hear you when you first started, so I just have a couple of questions. Are you talking about the major prophets and the minor prophets in this course?
No, I'm just talking about the book of Ezekiel, just the book.
Oh, you're just doing the book, okay, and you call him, what was the term you used, because he's exiled, what was the term you used?
Oh, he's considered an exilic normally, they divide the prophets into pre-exilic, post-exilic, and exilic. And Ezekiel and Daniel are considered exilic prophets. They're the only two that are considered. Yeah, they were exiled. Daniel was a little bit earlier. He was exiled a little bit earlier. And he was a little bit younger, but then.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. I mean.
Okay, I'm with you now. We're doing Ezekiel. Okay.
Okay.
So exhibit means that they were actually in Babylon. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it is kind of an odd term because even.
I've never heard of that term.
Yeah. So you have the deportation, and they were actually in exile. But is it a fine line? Because if you read Jeremiah, you read about Lamentations, and apparently he was back home, right? So it's the same time frame, some of the same time frame here, but he was back home in Judah. But
What do you think Daniel and his three friends, they were taken at the first, so in 605,
yeah.
they were taken, so they had already been in captivity, for a long time before Ezekiel was taken. So during that whole time, we see kind of the beginnings of the book of Daniel being played out, while Ezekiel was back in Jerusalem, and then finally, when the temple's destroyed, he's then taken as well.
Well, actually, he was a little bit before. That's surprising because the temple, 605 is Daniel, 605, and then 597 Ezekiel's taken.
Yeah.
Then 586 the temple is destroyed. So even that is,
So I'm sorry, he was taken the second wave.
yeah. So and I don't really know when the third wave is, but I know the 586 is when the temple, when Judah finally fell, and
He was taken as
597.
597.
so there's a bunch of dates, and it all kind of overlaps. You think, you think, they were taken to Judah and they came back 70 years later. Well, it's, the temple fell, and no, it's like kind of like the first wave, second wave, then finally the temple falls, and then they finally start coming back, and for years and years, and the whole thing I think lasted over 100 years. If you look at, from the very first people were deported until the very last came back, it's almost 100 years. So it's quite the deal. I mean, I can't even imagine that. I mean, you think, what's happened to America in 25 years or in 100 years? I mean, you go back to Teapot Dome and all that stuff about 100 years ago. Okay. So Babylon was a dominant world power under King Nebuchadnezzar. So they kind of ruled the roost. So really, you kind of look at it as kind of the big time rulers during biblical times. You have the Babylonians kind of ruled. And their end, actually, technically, they kind of ended because the Medes and Persians took them over, right? So you had the Babylonians. This is like in the book of Daniel, right? You had the Babylonians, and then the Medes and Persians, and that they actually took over during this time frame. So a lot of stuff's happening here. So during the deportation, the Babylonians themselves fell, and the Medes and Persians kind of snuck in and took them over. And then you have the Greeks, and then you have the Romans. And so it's kind of, but at this time it's Babylon the Great. Okay, the purpose of the book. Number one, to call the exiled Israelites to repentance. And that's a lot of the book if you just read it. It's the first part of it especially, it's just kind of, judgments, just judgment after judgment after judgment. To explain number two, to explain God's judgment on Judah and the nations. And number three, to give hope of the restoration of the new covenant. And there's some of that toward the end, because there is always, God saw this through, right? He allowed, and the fourth point is to reveal God's sovereignty over history. So God allowed, he apparently it was God's will that this would occur because there was too much sin in Judah, and he wanted he wanted repentance, and so he allowed this to happen. He allowed this. Otherwise, it never would have. It never would have. But had Israel been upright, their kingdom would have been prosperous, and they never would have never had to go back because of their sin. That's why we had to have this deportation and put in exile. The themes of the book of Ezekiel: God's holiness and glory. If we look at just in the first chapter, if you just read the first chapter, you'll probably think you're reading out of the book of Revelation. You're talking. Or maybe Isaiah chapter 6, to talk about the glory. It's kind of like the I don't know, maybe the throne room of God, where you have creatures, angelic creatures flying around. Number two, the theme is judgment for sin, and that's for sure. I mean, there's just chapter after chapter after chapter of judgments. Judging Israel. Chapter after chapter, and then it goes into the different countries surrounding Israel. Just chapter after chapter of judgments. Okay, and then third is the restoration and renewal. That's the good part, because at the very end, the end chapters start talking about restoration and renewal and the end of all this horribleness. Is that a word, horribleness? I'm not sure. Individual responsibility for sin. In chapter 18, that's one, that's one chapter you'll hear about in the church, right? It's chapter 18, because it talks about sin not being inherited. People are responsible for their own sins. Bad things happen because of other people's sins. But from an eternal point of view, we're all responsible for our own sins. You may suffer, in the time, in biblical times, you may suffer and, even be part of a punishment brought onto you because of the sins of your parent. But from an eternal point of view, no. I mean, eternally, you're responsible for your own sins. You will, on the last day, you'll be judged for your sins, not the sins of your father. And you do not inherit any sin from your parents. And the fifth theme is the future hope of a new temple and a restored Israel. So they have the restoration at the end. Israel will become a nation again, and it will thrive. I guess it'll never have. Oddly, they never really have kings anymore, but they still become a nation, and they go up, and it lasts, I guess, until 70 A.D. roughly. So you have roughly 600 years. It's got like 600 years left, and then it finally, in 70 A.D., there is no more Israel, really, I guess, until, I guess from a biblical point of view, from a religious point of view, but, what's this country over here now? How do we look at it? And to me, I guess I look at that as kind of an aberration. I mean, to me, I don't look at it as that as really, am I wrong? I mean, how do you deal with that I guess theologically it's kind of hard to deal with this country over here called Israel, but it's not really. Just say, I'm sorry. I don't know, does that make sense? I mean, I guess to me, we don't look at it as anything to do with, it's not really from God. I mean, they're religious people and all, but it's not really, it's not really the kingdom. Pardon me?
A lot of folks think that it is.
Yeah, there's a lot of people, religious people think that, but really, the Jews, unless you, and that for a Jew to become, to be saved, they have to accept the Jewish Messiah. I mean, we all do. We have to all accept Jesus Christ and trust and obey Jesus. And it's the same for the Jews. The Jews, okay, can a Jew be saved? Yes, of course, but a Jew would have to trust and obey Jesus and become a Christian. And they have to obey, they have to trust they have to obey the Jews, and they would agree, right, to say, if you have to ask a Jew, well, would a Jew be saved if they reject the Jewish Messiah? If they reject, no, the Scripture's clear. To be saved, a Jew must accept the Jewish Messiah when he comes, and he came. So I mean, they all need to accept the Jewish Messiah. So yeah, like today that we say the state of Israel, they have not accepted. The Jews there have not accepted the Jewish Messiah, and they're not going to be, recognized as, the kingdom of God or anything like that. Okay. Name and meaning. Okay, Ezekiel's name means God strengthens. So you can hear the A-L, Ezekiel, well, I guess it's an E-L, the E-L at the end of Ezekiel. And the Hebrew word for God, the basic word for God is Elohim. So you can kind of hear the start of Elohim at the end of the Ezekiel, and almost every, I won't say that, but a lot of, if you listen, a lot of names in the Old Testament are that way. You'll see the EL somewhere in there, in a name, a lot of the names. Or you'll see God in the names. Uh-huh.
What did you say, Ezekiel name mean, God, what now?
God strengthens. I'm sorry. Yeah, did I say? I probably
You
did.
said, but I just didn't.
Yeah, Ezekiel means God strengthens, and it's really strengthens God because the God's at the end, so it's kind of strengthens God. But I mean, it means God strengthens. But okay. And then we have in the first. Someone would like to read the first 3 verses of the book of Ezekiel?
I will. Now it came to pass for the 13th year, in the 4th month, in the 5th day of the month, as I was among the captives by the river of Chebar, that the heaven were opened, and I saw visions of God. In the 5th day of the month, which was the 5th year of the Jehoiachin captivity, the word of the Lord came expressingly unto Ezekiel, the priest, the son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river of Chebar, and the hand of the Lord was there upon him.
All right, thanks. So in that we can learn that first he was born into, he was a priest, so he was born into a priestly family. And we can learn a lot in these first 3 verses. You know, is along the river, okay, along the. Most people think of this Chebar was a little tributary or a canal off of, I guess, the Euphrates River in Babylon.
Yeah, I read somewhere where that was the water of the crops, it's kind of irrigation, the water of the
Yeah.
crops.
Yeah. I mean, because water's everything in those days, right? You know, if you're in agriculture, even today, water's everything. You know, if you watch farming videos, you know, in Nebraska where they don't have too much water, you know, the whole summer is all about irrigation. That's all they do is work on the irrigation systems all summer. I mean, water is everything. Like in Iowa, I mean, we never had irrigation because traditionally we had enough water. And then my brother, he's kind of suffering a little bit because he don't get as much rain as he used to. Seems to fall around him a little bit. So water is water is everything. I mean, if you look at any city, right, you're like, you know, like LA is Los Angeles. I mean, they're struggling today because lack of water. But you look at any major city, they have to have enough water to sustain it. And you're like, a lot of these, you know, you kind of wonder where it comes from. You look at New York, well, they have, you know, they have a water system that allow them to grow as much as they did. Los Angeles, they had a system of water to allow them to grow as big as they did. So in the end, you know, a city's going to struggle if they don't have enough water. And I'm sure, but it's kind of amazing the resilience of people, because if you look at just recently, if you look at the I mean, really, Israel was providing electricity and water for Gaza, right? And they cut that off when this war started, but still, somehow, those people lived through you know, over a year without electricity or water somehow. I guess they got something somewhere, but water is everything. Okay, and also he was exiled into Babylon in 597, along with King Jehoiachin. He was the last king, and it's kind of interesting that, you know, the Bible predicts he's going to be the last one. There's going to be Jehoiachin is going to be the last king, and if you look at history, that's true. There's even after the restoration, you know, there was no more kings, right? It was there's no kings after Jehoiachin. And he's called to be a prophet at age 30, and his ministry lasted 22 years. So he wrote and preached for 22 years. I think you preached a little bit longer, right? Acted out prophetic role, okay? And one thing, he acted out symbolic messages to illustrate God's judgment. So there's a lot of parables, but then there's also these acting outs where he does something to kind of illustrate the points, kind of like a parable in action, I guess. And he delivered oracles against Israel, Judah, and the surrounding nations. And he had visions. There's a lot of visions. Had visions of God's throne, the valley of dry bones, and the new temple. And he prophesied about the eventual restoration of Israel. So I go over the structure of the book. Chapters 1 to 24 is judgment on Israel. Chapters 25 to 32 is like judgment on the nations. And chapters 33 to 48 is kind of the restoration. So that's kind of how this goes. Any questions? Sure, Becky.
Were you saying that, that Ezekiel, was captured around age 30 and he was 22 years or he became a prophet around age 30 and 22 years of
Yeah, and then there's,
prophesying about Israel and Judah?
yeah, so he was captured at 30. And he was a priest, right? So it's kind of amazing. And
Well, was he not captured like 5 years before that?
Oh, yeah, that's true. Yeah, he's captured in 597. Then there's 5 years wait, and then 22 more years of preaching. So I have to look at the exact numbers. So is he really, when was he 30 when he started preaching? Yeah, I think he was 30 years old when he started preaching, but that was not in 597. That would have been in something like 593. So kind of going backward. I know those numbers don't add up, but they're off by one. But I think it starts.
And I guess that the prophecy would have began when this whirlwind comes in chapter 1, is when he started, the hand of the Lord came, and he saw the first vision.
Yeah, I mean, there's several chapters kind of that give it. I mean, it seems to be that, that's like the original. Then there's several. Then there's the commission, I guess, in chapter 3. There's kind of the, you know, in chapter 2, it kind of says, hey, stand on your feet. You know, that's kind of you have the, in chapter 1, you kind of have the whirlwind and the big vision. And then chapter 2, you know, he kind of says, stand on your feet. And in chapter 3, he kind of says, you know, eat this scroll. See this scroll, eat it. And that's kind of the, so it's kind of more than one chapter. It's kind of his commission, the way I look at it. Anyway, hopefully you guys can help me get this through. I mean, hopefully I won't bomb this thing any worse than I am. Oh, dear me.
So he and Daniel would have been about the same age.
Yeah, Daniel would have probably been 20 or less when he was taken in, so
He was taken in 605.
605. Yeah, so yeah, they've been,
Pretty close to the same age.
yeah, they both been, would have been definitely young men. And yeah, they would have been within 10 years of each other, probably within,
Amazing that Daniel doesn't speak about Ezekiel.
or either,
Any mention of him in his book.
yeah, that's a good question. Is there any crosstalk between the two?
I don't
Yeah.
know that Ezekiel mentioned Daniel. So.
Yeah, so,
But, of course, the Babylonians settled the Israelites all throughout their country. So they may not even really have had much interaction. Because Daniel would have been, what's the capital of Babylon? Was it Babylon?
I think it's Babylon itself,
But
right?
he
Yeah.
would have been at the capital, whereas Ezekiel might have been sent out somewhere else. Does it ever say?
I think he was also around Babylon. I mean, I think they're both right near the capital, so it is kind of strange, but then, I mean, they didn't have cell phones or even telephones, right? I mean, if,
The other thing is too, I don't believe Ezekiel ever mentions where the Babylonians changed his name. Whereas with Daniel, Meshach,
Yeah.
they were all, Hananiah and Mishael, those three also got new names.
Yeah, I mean-
Ezekiel gave them a new name.
I mean, Daniel was kind of in servitude he was from the top, right? He was kind of the top of the food chain. You know, the people that he was definitely with the leadership of the country, kind of like being part, being worked around the cabinet room or something. Or the West Wing. He was definitely there at the top. So, thank you for being patient with me. Hopefully I can